A low wind whispered through the cottonwoods as dusk spilled across the plains, dragging long shadows over dry earth. The barn stood quiet, just a silhouette against the bruised sky, but something about the stillness felt wrong. Not the usual kind that came with solitude. This was heavier, watched. From the front porch, her hand still resting on a chipped mug of coffee gone cold, Clara Dunn could see them. 10 of them, on foot, bare, silent, and standing in a line just beyond the tall grass. Apache. They made no sound, no movement, just the wind fluttering the feathers braided in their hair, the last light glinting off their dark eyes like obsidian. She didn't reach for her rifle, not yet. 10 Apaches don't show up for a white woman's ranch in the middle of nowhere by accident. Let's go back to where it started. Clara hadn't always been alone. There was a time when this land had echoed with the bark of dogs, the creak of saddles, and the warmth of a man's laughter across supper. But that was before the coughing started, before Levi's breath turned shallow, then vanished altogether in a fevered sweat 2 winters ago. They buried him under the lone cottonwood he'd planted on their first year here. Since then, it had just been Clara and the dust. Most days passed slow as sap. Chores, bread, fence posts, repeating tasks until the calendar wore thin. She kept herself busy, hands calloused and hair tucked into a loose braid, like the women in town did when their husbands died and no new ones came courting. But Clara hadn't come to the frontier for courtship. She came for quiet. And for a while, quiet suited her. Until that morning last week. She was kneeling by the chicken coop, scraping out the muck, when she heard the whimper, soft like a rabbit caught in the wire. At first she ignored it. Coyotes sometimes cried like that, and a woman alone couldn't afford to go chasing every lost sound. But then, she saw the boy. He couldn't have been more than 10. Dark skin caked with dust, hair tangled, half matted. His ribs poked through his chest like the slats of a broken fence, and his eyes, Lord, his eyes, were full of something she hadn't seen in a long time. Not fear, not anger, just hunger. The kind that hollows a soul out from the inside. He didn't say a word, just collapsed there in her cabbage patch, the morning sun curling around his limp frame like he'd belonged to the dirt all along. Clara didn't think. She lifted him gently, surprised by how little he weighed, brought him inside, washed the blood from his knees, left bread on the table, and stepped back like she was taming a wild horse. He didn't eat at first, just stared at the floor, shoulders trembling. But eventually, he took a bite, then another, then everything. She didn't ask where he came from. Not yet, just laid a blanket by the hearth and let him sleep. The next day, he was gone. And now they were here. 10 of them. Warriors, she assumed, though their hands weren't on their weapons. Some older, some younger. One woman among them, her eyes rimmed red, but hard like carved wood. They hadn't stepped past the fence line. Not yet. Clara stood from her porch slowly, knees stiff from sitting too long. The mug cracked in her grip from the pressure, then fell and shattered on the boards. Nobody flinched. She took a step forward. "I fed a boy," she said, voice dry from the wind. "That's all I did." Silence. The wind picked up, rustling the grass like something shifting just beneath the surface. Her hands twitched toward her Henry rifle leaning by the door, but she didn't reach. Then one of the men took a step forward, middle-aged, heavy braids, a scar slicing down his jaw like lightning. He looked at her the way a man might look at a knife, useful but dangerous. The woman beside him raised her hand, then pointed to the barn. Clara turned her head slowly. The doors were shut. She hadn't looked in there since morning. The boy. Her boots echoed too loud as she crossed the yard. The barn door groaned as she pushed it open. Light spilled through the high slats, cutting across the dust like broken glass. He was inside, tucked behind a bale of hay, curled up, arms around his knees, eyes wide with the kind of knowing a child shouldn't carry. When she saw him, he didn't move, didn't smile, just blinked, slow, tired, waiting. Clara let the door ease shut behind her. Her voice came soft, low.
The boy didn't speak, just stared. Outside, the line of Apaches hadn't budged. They didn't shout, didn't charge. They waited. That kind of stillness, controlled, measured, was worse than shouting. It meant they'd already made peace with whatever came next. Clara felt something tighten in her chest. A question took shape in her bones, sharp and cold. What happens now? She looked at the boy again, then turned toward the light slipping through the cracks. Her fingers brushed the barn wall. It felt like the whole world was holding its breath. She stepped back outside. "They're looking for a child," she said to the wind. "But I don't know who he is, only that he was hungry." The man with the scar stared at her. Then, finally, he nodded once. He didn't speak either. But his eyes weren't full of rage. They were full of grief. And that, somehow, felt even worse. The sun had almost disappeared now. The horizon burned gold behind the silhouettes. Clara stood between her barn and the waiting strangers, not knowing if she was about to be judged for kindness or punished for it. And then the woman stepped forward, one slow step, then another. She was coming toward the porch, alone. Clara's fingers tensed. The woman stopped 6 feet away. She looked Clara straight in the eye, and then, in a voice cracked with something older than pain, she whispered, "His name is Taza." Then she waited. And Clara didn't know what to say. But the wind had stopped, the world had gone still, and the sun was gone. The night settled in heavy and quiet, pressing against the windows like a question no one wanted to answer. Clara sat at the edge of her wooden porch, boots on the steps, palms resting on her knees. Her rifle leaned just inside the open door, but she hadn't touched it. Not when the woman spoke, not when the boy's name, Taza, slipped from her mouth like an offering. Inside the barn, the child slept again, curled around a blanket like it might protect him from the weight of 10 watchful souls waiting in the dark. They hadn't moved, not a single Apache. Their figures still lined the edge of the property, shadows against shadows now. No fire, no sound, just the flicker of stars above and that steady sense of being watched. Clara could have sent him out. That would have been the simple thing. Push open the barn door, tell him to go, let whatever storm he brought pass through and leave her ranch untouched. But her hands wouldn't do it. Instead, she stood and lit a second lamp, then a third, set them near the barn, near the fence line. A small act, a signal. She didn't know what it meant exactly, only that the boy hadn't eaten again since she found him, and she couldn't let him leave like that. Not hungry. By the time the knock came at the door, 3 soft taps that somehow made her stomach flip, she already knew who it would be. Not the boy, not the woman. A white man, Sheriff Halford. "Evening, Miss Dunn," he said, touching the brim of his hat. He wasn't alone. 2 deputies lingered behind him, rifles slung but not drawn. The horses stomped and snorted in the dry dirt, uneasy. Clara folded her arms. "This about the Apaches?"
Alfred nodded, jaw tight. "Heard about it in town. Some freight boys saw the group near your land yesterday. One of the McKinney girls said you were seen speaking with a native boy." Clara didn't answer, just stared. Halford sighed. "Clara, I ain't here to stir trouble, but people are nervous. Apache moving in groups like that, it's got folks spooked." "They haven't crossed the fence," she said. "Haven't hurt a soul. That we know of." She narrowed her eyes. "You think they're here to scalp a widow and burn my barn? You think they marched 10 strong out here just to raid a cabbage patch?" The sheriff looked tired, not angry, just worn. "There was a raid east of Fort Wesson 2 weeks back. Miners. 3 dead, another missing." He took off his hat, rubbed the sweat from his forehead. "You see a child, Clara?" She didn't answer. He looked at her then, not as a lawman, but as someone who'd buried 2 sons to fever and 1 to a railroad accident. "Clara, I am a good woman. You gave 'em bread, maybe shelter. No one's judging that. But harboring one of their own, especially if you ran from something, puts you right in the middle of a war nobody's asked for." She stepped closer, voice quiet. "And what if I'm not the one in the middle? What if he is?" The sheriff didn't have an answer, but the younger deputy behind him did. "Ma'am," the boy said, maybe 22 at best, "if you keep that kid hidden and something happens, we won't be able to stop it. 10 warriors now, maybe 30 tomorrow." Clara didn't flinch. "I didn't ask for protection." "No," the sheriff said gently, "but if you don't want blood on your land, I suggest you let us take the boy. We'll figure it out, with the fort, with the tribe, quietly." She studied him, the way his hands fidgeted, the slight shift in his eyes when he said, quietly. "What's his name?" she asked. The sheriff frowned. "Who?" "The boy." I don't know." She nodded, just once. "Then you can't have him." Halford shifted. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." "No," she said softly, "I think you are." They stood like that, the moon high above, the dust curling in the wind like ghosts of 100 bad choices. The sheriff stared at her, then past her, toward the barn, toward the invisible weight of 10 unmoving warriors who hadn't come to fight, but hadn't left either. Finally, Halford stepped back. "You've got till morning." "That a warning?" He shook his head. "It's mercy." The men rode off slow, like the air itself didn't want them gone. Clara waited until the hoofbeats faded, then turned and walked back inside. She found the boy awake, sitting up in the straw. His eyes didn't follow her. They stared straight ahead, frozen, like he knew what was coming. She knelt beside him, smoothing the blanket. "You have family out there?" she asked. He didn't speak, just nodded, slow. "They think you're hurt? Taken?" His breath caught. Another nod. She leaned back, watching him. "And if I walk you out there, into the dark, what happens to me?" The boy turned his face toward her the first time. He didn't look afraid, just tired, so tired. He whispered something in Apache. Clara shook her head. "I don't understand." He tried again, slower. "Not hurt. I run." She blinked. "Why?"
The boy looked down. Then, after a long silence, he touched his chest, near the ribs, and whispered, "Not warrior." Something sharp curled in Clara's gut. She didn't need to speak his language to understand. The 10 outside weren't a war party. They were a family, and the boy had left them, or been cast out. He wasn't being hunted. He was being returned. But why? And why here? Outside, a coyote called. Another answered. The wind shifted. She could smell firewood, faint, from the Apache camp. She looked down at Taza, small, thin, covered in the dust of 2 nations who didn't know what to do with each other, and she realized something. In the morning, the law would come, and in the dark, a mother waited. A choice had to be made, and she had just hours to make it. The wind had changed. It came now from the south, warm and dry, stirring the wheat-colored grass in long waves, as if the land itself were bracing for what would come. The moon cast a cold silver across the field, painting the line of 10 Apaches in pale shadows. Still, they did not move. Inside the house, Clara sat with her back against the wall, lantern burning low, the boy asleep beneath her old quilt on the rug. She hadn't changed clothes, couldn't. Every movement felt like it might crack the silence in half. It was past midnight when she finally stood. She didn't wake the boy, just stepped quietly onto the porch, letting the screen door ease shut behind her. The prairie was bone quiet, not even a nightbird to break the hush. Then a sound, a rhythm, distant, like a slow heartbeat riding on the wind. Drums. She turned east, toward the low hills. The sound was faint but steady. Not fast, not aggressive, but present. Announcing. The Apaches were no longer waiting in silence. They were preparing. Clara walked slowly to the fence line, heart knocking in her throat. The woman from before, the one who had spoken the boy's name, stepped forward. This time, she didn't stop. She walked until they stood 3 feet apart, eyes locked. No war paint, no rifle, just a single strand of beads around her neck, and a tension that hummed beneath her skin like a bowstring drawn too long. Clara spoke first. "He's here. He's alive. And he's scared. The woman tilted her head. He ran. Clara nodded. He was hungry. He didn't steal. He didn't harm. He just left. The woman's jaw tightened. Boys do not leave. Not alone. Silence stretched between them, long and taut. Clara didn't break it with words. She just looked toward the barn. The woman followed her gaze. "You're his mother," Clara said softly. The woman blinked, just once. "He said he's not a warrior. Is that why you let him go?"
Something flickered in the woman's expression. Pain, maybe, or a memory. "He shamed his uncle," she said at last. "He would not cut. He would not strike. The calf screamed, and he wept." Clara swallowed. "So they left him behind." The woman looked away. "He ran." "And you followed." "I followed because I birthed him." They stood the starlight like statues carved from the land itself. Two women, one white, one Apache, separated by grief neither could name fully, not in English, not in Apache. Clara's voice dropped. "The law's coming at first light. They want to take him, say it's safer that way." The woman's face hardened. "White safety is not our safety." Clara nodded. "I know." Then she said the thing she hadn't said all night. "I want to walk him to you, myself. No guns, no deputies, no misunderstandings." The woman studied her, measured her. "You trust us?" Clara's mouth twitched. "I trust a mother." A long moment passed. Then the woman reached into the folds of her dress and pulled out a single item, a smooth, carved bone pendant. She pressed it into Clara's palm. "Wear this. They will know you came with me." And then she turned and walked back to her people. Clara stood there a moment longer. Heart pounding. The drums were louder now, steady, unhurried, not war drums. Ceremony. She returned to the house and lit another lantern, letting its light fill the parlor. Taza was awake, sitting up, eyes wide and wet. "You heard," she said. He nodded. "I'll take you home, but you have to walk with me. No running." The boy hesitated, then stood. He didn't speak. He just stepped toward her. She reached for his hand, but he pulled back. Instead, he walked to the hearth and picked up a small object, a carved horse, no bigger than her thumb, something Levi had made years ago, during one of those long winters when the snow kept them indoors for days. He pressed it into her palm. Clara blinked. "You sure?" He nodded. They left just before dawn. No horses, no lamps. Just Clara in her coat, the bone pendant hanging from a leather cord around her neck, and the boy walking silently beside her. The land was ghostly in the first light, cold, but not hostile. The Apaches had moved. They were no longer by the fence line. They were waiting at the ridge, a short distance into the hills. Clara and Taza walked slowly. No one moved to meet them, until at last the boy broke away from her side and ran, quietly, quickly, into the waiting arms of the woman. She knelt to catch him, held him fiercely, her face buried in his shoulder. And then, one by one, the others stepped forward and encircled them. A soft hum began, a chant, low and mournful, but not angry.
Clara stood a few feet back, heart thundering. She didn't know what to do. And then, the oldest man among them stepped forward, his hair white, his spine crooked, but his gaze strong. He spoke, not in English, not in anything she could understand, but his tone was solemn, respectful. Then he bowed. Just once. A single gesture. And Clara, she returned it. The woman stood again, holding the boy close. She walked up to Clara and looked her in the eye. "No more running," she said softly. And Clara nodded. Behind her, hoofbeats. She turned to see Sheriff Halford and 3 others just cresting the horizon. Her time was up, but something had changed. She turned back, and the ridge was empty. They were gone.
as if swallowed by the land, but the bone pendant still hung warm against her chest, and in her hand, the small wooden horse. The sheriff reined in his horse just as the last trace of footprints disappeared into the ridgeline. "What happened?" he called out, sliding down from the saddle, boots crunching over brittle grass. "Where'd they go?" Clara didn't turn right away. She stood facing the horizon, the first rays of sun melting the frost from the prairie. Her fingers tightened around the small, carved horse in her palm, its edges warm from the boy's touch. "They left," she said finally. Quiet. Peaceful. Halford stepped beside her, squinting into the distance, his jaw flexed. The boy? Gone home. He looked at her. Not angry. Not yet. Just cautious. "Clara, you had an understanding." She turned to him now, the pendant swinging gently at her throat. "You said I had till morning. It's morning, and they're gone." Behind him, one of the deputies muttered something under his breath, too quiet to make out. The other two stayed on their horses, fidgeting, glancing toward the hills like they half expected arrows to come whistling down at any moment. Halford exhaled hard through his nose. "You're going to have trouble now. People don't forget things like this out here." She met his gaze. "Neither do I." He nodded slowly. Then, to his men, "Let's ride." They turned without another word, hooves kicking up small puffs of dust as they vanished over the rise back toward town. Clara stood alone in the silence they left behind. Back at the house, she sat on the porch with a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold, the way she had the night before. The land around her looked the same. The barn, the hills, the wind-stirred trees, but something had shifted. Not outside. Inside her. That afternoon, she went to the barn. The hay still smelled sweet. The dust still danced in the shafts of sunlight spilling through the rafters. She knelt where Taza had slept and tucked the little horse onto a beam by the window.
A week passed, then another. Whispers reached her, carried by mailmen and wandering traders. Talk of an Apache boy who had returned to his people. A peace offering, some said. Others called it a warning. A few claimed the boy had been sick, cursed, touched by something unclean. Stories twisted themselves into rumors until nobody could tell what was truth anymore. Clara kept to herself, repaired the chicken coop, planted early corn, watched the sky for storms. But on the 12th morning, she found something strange on her porch. A bundle, wrapped in deer hide, tied with sinew. She opened it slowly. Inside was a necklace of dried berries, carefully woven, a handful of cedar leaves, and a single white feather, so soft it barely weighed a thing. At the bottom was a scrap of cloth she recognized, a corner from the blanket she'd wrapped Taza in. No note, no signature, just a gesture. She sat there for a long time, the bundle in her lap, the feather between her fingers. Spring deepened. The neighbors stopped visiting. Some out of suspicion, others out of fear, and a few Clara guessed out of respect. No one quite knew what had happened out on the ridge, only that it had been hers to carry. And she did. Quietly. Even years later, when the railroad came slicing through the north pasture and new settlers arrived with fences and bright painted wagons, she still kept the little carved horse in its place. Dust collected around it, but she never moved it. Once, while at the trading post in town, she overheard a boy speaking in a rough accent, practicing words in English. He said his name was Taza. Clara didn't approach him, just watched from the corner, lips pressed into a thin line. He looked older, taller, wore a shirt stitched with patterns she didn't recognize. But his eyes still carried the quiet of someone who had once run from everything, and then chose to return. Later that night, she found the bone pendant still hanging by her door. She hadn't worn it since that morning on the ridge. She put it back around her neck and stepped onto the porch. The stars were out. The prairie hummed with crickets and wind and the rustling of a world always in motion. She sat down, coffee in hand, and whispered the boy's name once to the night. Taza. No one answered, but the quiet, somehow, didn't feel so lonely anymore. Years passed like pages turned in a book no one was reading out loud. Clara's ranch stayed quiet, not untouched, not unchanged, but still. It grew into something solid, a place known more for its silence than its story. The children of newer settlers would ride past her fences and slow their ponies, glancing toward the old woman on the porch with the leather cord always hanging around her neck. The one who never married again, who never left. They didn't know what happened, only that something had. She didn't tell them. Not because it was a secret, but because it didn't need to be a story. It had already been a life. But there were reminders. A winter night, a knock at the door, a bundle of dried herbs left on her steps, a carved stone tucked into the edge of her fence post, shaped like a mountain, or maybe a bird. Once in late autumn, she found a leather pouch hanging from her apple tree. Inside was a folded scrap of rawhide, etched with symbols she didn't understand but felt in her chest, like the weight of something remembered. Beneath it was a single small wooden horse, not the one Levi had carved, a new one, rough but careful.
She sat with it for a long time, fingers tracing the edges. And then she added it to the shelf beside the original. 2 horses. One passed, one returned. That spring, Clara started keeping a journal. Nothing formal, just notes, bits of weather, thoughts that floated through her as the sun crossed the sky. She didn't write about Taza at first, but one morning, as the wind carried the scent of mesquite and dry sage across the fields, she found herself writing his name without meaning to, just Taza. Then below it, he did not strike the calf. She didn't know why she remembered that part the most, maybe because it was the first time she'd understood that gentleness could look like defiance, that kindness, quiet, simple, unremarkable, could shake the foundations of what people believed made a man. And maybe that's why he ran. Not out of fear, but because the world didn't yet know what to do with a boy like that. In time, news traveled, the kind that arrived slow, through whispers and second-hand letters. One said a young Apache man had helped broker peace between a small group of settlers and a tribe resisting relocation. Another told of a school on the reservation, started not by the government, but by a young woman and her brother, 2 names lost to time. Still another, years later, mentioned a translator traveling with a treaty group, quiet, polite, with a feather tied into his braid and fluent English he never boasted about. Clara never asked. She didn't need to. She believed, in her bones, that Taza had grown into something the world didn't expect. Not a warrior, not a servant, not a pawn in someone else's idea of justice, but something else. Something still. One summer evening, long after her hair had gone silver and the porch steps had begun to creak under her own bones, a rider came up the road. Not fast, not loud. He wore no uniform, carried no weapons she could see. Just a plain shirt, buckskin trousers, and a long braid down his back. He didn't look up when he dismounted, just tied his horse gently to the old post, and approached the porch with quiet steps. Clara stood slowly, feeling every year in her knees. He stopped 3 feet away and raised his hand in greeting, not in a salute, not in a wave, just a still, respectful gesture, the same way his mother had greeted her on that first night. She nodded once. He sat on the steps beside her without a word. They didn't speak for a long while. The sun lowered itself behind the hills, casting gold and blood orange across the sky. Finally, he pulled something from his satchel and held it out to her. A blanket. The one she had wrapped him in. carefully mended, newly lined, preserved. She took it without a word. Her hands trembled, but she didn't let them. The boy, now a man, rested his elbows on his knees and looked out over the fields. "My name," he said softly, "is still Taza." Clara looked over, eyes wet but steady. "I'm glad. I wanted to thank you, but I didn't have words."
"You didn't need them." He smiled, just a little, and the years melted away in the lines of his face. They sat there until the stars came out, and when he rose to leave, he didn't ask for anything. He just bowed his head, gently. And she laid a hand on his shoulder, just once. Then he was gone, like the wind. Clara sat back down, the blanket folded in her lap, the air thick with crickets and silence. No newspapers would write about it. No sermons would mention it. But a boy had once crossed the threshold of her barn, hungry, shaking, and alone. And he had left a man, not because of war, but because of mercy. And when Clara died years later, in her sleep, the ranch hands found 2 small horses above her hearth, a journal filled with weather and names and quiet thoughts, and a necklace of carved bone tucked into her hand. They buried her beneath the cottonwood tree Levi had planted, in the earth that had known both silence and story. And far away, across a wide and dry land, a man named Taza stood still in the morning light, head bowed, not saying a word, but remembering. And in that moment, the wind did not blow. It listened.